The dust clung to Grace Remington's traveling dress like a second skin as she descended from the train onto the wooden platform of Quartz Hill, California. Her hands empty, except for the telegram that had brought her here, a telegram that turned out to be a cruel lie. She stood alone in the blazing September heat of 1882, watching the locomotive pull away with a shriek of its whistle, carrying with it her last connection to everything she had known, and she realized with a sinking feeling that twisted her stomach into knots that the teaching position she had been promised did not exist, had never existed, and that whoever had sent her that telegram had disappeared like smoke in the wind. The platform cleared quickly as other passengers were greeted by loved ones or moved purposefully toward the town's main street, leaving Grace standing in a circle of her own uncertainty, the sun beating down mercilessly on her shoulders. She had spent every cent she possessed on the train ticket from Boston, sold her mother's pearl earrings to afford a decent dress for the interview, and now she had nothing but the clothes on her back and a growing sense of panic that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The town of Quartz Hill spread before her in shades of brown and gold, buildings constructed of sun-bleached wood lining a wide dirt road, mountains rising in the distance like silent sentinels guarding secrets she could not begin to guess. She had no family to return to, no friends who could take her in, no resources to secure passage back east even if she wanted to go. Her parents had died in the fire that swept through their neighborhood 2 years ago, and she had been scraping by as a seamstress ever since, saving every penny for the education that would allow her to become a teacher. The telegram had seemed like Providence itself, an answer to prayers she had whispered into the darkness of too many lonely nights. Now it revealed itself as nothing more than a mirage, and she was stranded in a town she did not know, in a state she had never visited, with absolutely nowhere to turn. Grace forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite the fear that clawed at her chest. She would go to the sheriff, explain her situation, perhaps find work doing laundry or mending or cooking until she could earn enough to survive. She would not cry, would not give in to the despair that lurked at the edges of her consciousness, would not allow herself to crumble under the weight of this disaster. She had survived worse. She would survive this too. She picked up her skirts and walked toward the main street, her boots clicking on the wooden planks, her chin held high despite everything. The town was larger than she had expected, with a hotel, a saloon, several shops, a bank, and what appeared to be a mining office. Men in dusty work clothes moved between buildings, and a few women in calico dresses watched her from beneath the shade of overhanging roofs. Grace felt their eyes on her like brands, marking her as an outsider, a stranger, someone who did not belong. She was searching for a sign that might indicate the sheriff's office when she heard the sound of hooves on packed earth, rhythmic and purposeful, growing closer. She turned and found herself looking up at a man on horseback, and something in her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He sat easy in the saddle, tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. His face was tanned from long hours outdoors, strong-featured, with a straight nose and a mouth that looked like it smiled easily though it was serious now. He wore a worn but clean shirt, leather vest, and a hat that had seen better days, and there was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of quiet confidence, of a man who knew his place in the world and did not need to prove it to anyone. "You the teacher from Boston?" he asked, his voice deep and warm, with an accent that spoke of years spent in California. Grace felt her throat tighten. "I was supposed to be. The position does not exist." Something flickered across his face, anger, she thought, directed not at her but at whoever had perpetrated this deception. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, landing lightly on his feet, and she noticed that he was several inches taller than her own respectable height. Up close, she could see the golden flecks in his brown eyes, the faint lines at the corners that suggested he spent more time squinting into the sun than sitting indoors. "Jack Erikson," he said, extending his hand. "I heard about what happened. Man who sent those telegrams was running a scheme promising women jobs that did not exist, then demanding money for passage back home. Sheriff ran him out of town 2 days ago, but you were already on your way." Grace shook his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. "Grace Remington, I have no money for passage anywhere. I spent everything I had getting here." He did not release her hand immediately, and she found herself reluctant to pull away. There was something solid about him, something steadying, and she desperately needed something solid to hold on to. "I know," he said quietly, "and I am sorry for that, but I might have a solution if you are willing to hear it." She waited, barely breathing, hope and caution warring in her chest. "I have a ranch about 5 miles outside town. It is not much, but it is mine, and I am trying to build it into something that matters. I lost my housekeeper last month. She moved to San Francisco to live with her daughter, and I have been managing on my own, but the truth is I need help. Someone to cook, to keep the house, to manage things when I am out with the cattle or working the land. It is hard work, and it is lonely out there, but I pay fair wages, and you would have your own room, your own space. It is a job, at least, a place to start." Grace studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that this was another trap waiting to spring. But his eyes were steady, honest, and there was something in his expression that looked almost like sympathy, as though he understood what it meant to have nowhere else to turn. "Why would you offer this to a stranger?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because someone helped me once when I had nothing," he said simply. "And because I was raised to believe that when you see someone in trouble, you do what you can. If you would rather find something else, I understand. But the offer stands." She thought of the empty platform behind her, the disappearing train, the vast and unfamiliar landscape that surrounded this town. She thought of nights spent sleeping in alleys, of hunger that gnawed at your belly until you could think of nothing else, of the men who looked at desperate women with eyes that promised nothing good. And she thought of this man, this Jack Erikson, who had dismounted from his horse to offer her not charity but work, not pity but opportunity. "I accept," she said, and was surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Thank you." He smiled then, a slow, warm smile that transformed his face, and Grace felt something flutter in her chest that she firmly told herself was only relief. "Good. Let me get you some water first. You look like you could use it, and then we will head out to the ranch. Fair warning, the road is rough, and it will take us a couple hours to get there." He led her to a trough where his horse was drinking and pumped fresh water into a tin cup, which he handed to her. Grace drank gratefully, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat, washing away some of the dust that coated her mouth. She had not realized how thirsty she was until that moment, how the heat had been slowly draining her. "You ride?" Jack asked, nodding toward his horse, a beautiful chestnut mare with intelligent eyes. "Not well," Grace admitted. "I have been on a horse perhaps 3 times in my life, all of them gentle ponies in parks." "That will do. Copper here is gentle enough." "You will ride, and I will walk alongside until we get beyond the town. Then I will ride behind you and make sure you do not fall." "Does that work?" "It would have to work." Grace nodded, and before she could protest, Jack had his hands on her waist, lifting her into the saddle as though she weighed nothing at all. His touch was brief, impersonal, but Grace felt the heat of it through the fabric of her dress, felt the strength in his hands. She settled into the saddle, gripping the pommel, and tried not to think about how high up she was, how far the ground seemed. Jack took the reins and began leading Copper through the town, walking beside the horse with an easy stride. People called greetings to him as they passed, and he responded with nods and brief words, clearly well known and well liked. Grace sat stiffly in the saddle, acutely aware of the stares that followed them, of the speculation that must be running through the minds of everyone who saw them together. "They will talk," Jack said, as though reading her thoughts. "Small town, not much else to do, but they are good people mostly. They will get used to seeing you around." "What will they say?" Grace asked, then immediately regretted the question. It did not matter what they would say. She had no other choice. "They will wonder who you are and what you are doing here. They will probably assume you are my new housekeeper, which is true, so there is nothing to worry about. Some of them will probably speculate about whether you are something more than that, but that is just boredom talking. It will pass." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. The idea of being something more to this man, this stranger who had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than anyone had in months, was both absurd and oddly unsettling. They left the town behind, following a road that wound through scrubland dotted with Joshua trees and sage. The mountains rose on either side, their slopes covered in chaparral and granite outcroppings that gleamed in the afternoon light. It was a harsh landscape, beautiful in its own way, but unforgiving. Grace could see why people came here seeking gold and silver, willing to endure the heat and isolation for the promise of wealth, but she could also see why many of them failed. This land did not give up its treasures easily. Once they were out of sight of the town, Jack swung up into the saddle behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. Grace stiffened, suddenly aware of his chest against her back, his thighs bracketing hers, the warmth of his body in the space between them. It was the most intimate contact she had ever had with a man, and it sent her heart racing in a way that was both alarming and strangely thrilling. "Relax," Jack said quietly, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "I have got you. You will not fall." Grace forced herself to breathe, to loosen the rigid set of her shoulders. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid strength of him behind her, and gradually, despite everything, she began to feel safe. He handled the horse with practiced ease, guiding Copper along the rough road with subtle shifts of his weight and gentle commands that the mare responded to immediately. "Tell me about Boston," Jack said after they had ridden in silence for a while. "What made you want to leave?" Grace considered how much to tell him, how much of her story to share with this man who was still essentially a stranger. But something about the vastness of the landscape, the fact that they were moving through this empty space together, made her want to talk, to fill the silence with words that might help her make sense of what had happened. "There was nothing left for me there," she said finally. "My parents died 2 years ago in a tenement fire. I had no siblings, no other family. I was working as a seamstress, barely making enough to pay for a room in a boarding house and 1 meal a day. I wanted more than that. I wanted to teach, to make a difference, to have a life that mattered. When I saw the advertisement for a teaching position here, it seemed like the answer I had been praying for. And instead it was a lie. Yes." The word came out more bitter than she intended. Jack was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking, could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. "I am sorry that happened to you. You deserved better than that. But for what it is worth, I am glad you are here. The ranch has been lonely since Mrs. Patterson left, and I could use the help. And maybe, if things work out, this could be the new start you were looking for, even if it is not the one you expected." Grace wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this disaster could somehow transform into an opportunity. But she had learned the hard way that hope was a dangerous thing, that it could blind you to reality, leave you vulnerable to disappointment. Still, what choice did she have? She was here, she had accepted his offer, and she would have to make the best of it. "What kind of ranch is it?" she asked, trying to focus on practical matters. "Cattle, mostly. I have about 200 head right now, and I am hoping to expand that over the next few years. I also have a few horses I am breeding, nothing fancy but good working animals. The house is small, just 3 rooms, but it is solid. I built most of it myself. There is a barn, a corral, a chicken coop. Like I said, it is not much, but it is mine." There was pride in his voice, and Grace found herself curious about this man who had offered her refuge. "How long have you had it?" "3 years. I worked as a ranch hand for a man named Thomas Whitmore for 5 years before that, saved every penny I earned. When he decided to sell off a portion of his land, he gave me first option to buy, said I had earned it. I have been building it up ever since." That must have taken tremendous discipline. It took knowing what I wanted and being willing to work for it. My father was a drifter, never settled anywhere, never built anything that lasted. I did not want that life. I wanted roots, something permanent, something I could pass down if I ever have children. The mention of children made Grace's breath catch, though she could not have said why. It was a perfectly normal thing for a man his age to think about. He could not be more than 28 or 29. She guessed. Old enough to have established himself, but young enough to still have his whole life ahead of him. The fact that he was unmarried, that he apparently lived alone on his ranch, seemed odd for a man who wanted children. As if sensing her unspoken question, Jack added, "I was engaged once, about 2 years ago. She decided ranch life was not for her and married a banker in Sacramento instead. It worked out for the best." Grace heard the hint of old pain beneath the casual words and felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. "I am sorry. Do not be. She would have been miserable out here, and I would have been miserable trying to make her happy. Sometimes things do not work out because they are not meant to." They fell into a comfortable silence after that, the only sounds the steady clop of Copper's hooves, the creak of the saddle, the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. The sun moved slowly across the sky, and the shadows lengthened, bringing a slight relief from the heat. Grace found herself relaxing despite everything, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid presence of the man behind her. When they finally crested a rise and Jack said, "There it is," Grace looked down into a small valley and felt something in her chest loosen. The ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwood trees, their leaves already starting to turn gold with the approach of autumn. It was indeed small, a simple wooden structure with a porch across the front and a stone chimney rising from one side. But it looked well maintained, the wood freshly painted, the yard tidy. The barn was larger than she expected, built of the same weathered wood, and she could see cattle grazing in a fenced pasture beyond. It looked like a home. Not the grand house she had once dreamed of, not the comfortable Boston townhouse her parents had rented, but a real home nonetheless, built with care and inhabited with purpose. Jack guided Copper down the slope and into the yard, then dismounted and reached up to help Grace down. She slid from the saddle into his waiting hands, and for a moment they stood close together, his hands on her waist, her palms resting on his shoulders for balance. Their eyes met, and Grace felt that strange flutter in her chest again, that awareness of him as more than just her rescuer, more than just her employer. Then Jack stepped back, releasing her, and the moment passed. "Let me show you the house," he said, his voice carefully neutral. He led her up onto the porch and through the front door into a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. It was clean but Spartan, with a wooden table and chairs, a cast iron stove, shelves lined with dishes and supplies, and a comfortable-looking chair near the fireplace. A doorway led to what she assumed was Jack's bedroom, and he indicated another door on the opposite side of the room. That was Mrs. Patterson's room. It is yours now. There is a bed, a wardrobe, a washstand. Not much, but it is private. Grace walked to the door and looked inside. The room was small but adequate, with a narrow bed covered by a quilt, a simple wardrobe against one wall, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. A window looked out over the pasture, and afternoon light streamed through the glass, warming the wooden floor. It was more than she had expected, more than she had any right to hope for. "It is perfect," she said and meant it. Jack looked relieved. "Good. I will let you get settled, then I will show you around outside, introduce you to the animals. Supper is usually around 6 if that works for you. I am a decent cook, but nothing fancy. Mostly beans and beef and whatever vegetables I can get from the garden. You have a garden, such as it is. Mrs. Patterson maintained it better than I do. Maybe you will have better luck with it." Grace nodded, still taking it all in, still trying to process the fact that this was where she would be living, that this man and this place were now her reality. "Jack," she said, and he turned back to look at her. "Thank you for everything. I do not know what would have happened to me if you had not been there today." His expression softened. "You do not need to thank me. Just do good work, and we will call it even." But as he left her alone in the small room to compose herself, to try to make sense of the extraordinary turn her life had taken, Grace knew it was not even, knew she owed him more than she could repay with cooking and cleaning. He had given her not just a job but dignity, not just shelter but hope, and that was a debt she would carry whether he wanted her to or not. She sat down on the bed and let herself feel, for the first time since stepping off the train, the full weight of her exhaustion, her fear, her relief. And underneath all of that, buried so deep she almost did not recognize it, a tiny seed of something that might, if she was very careful and very lucky, grow into happiness. The first week at the ranch passed in a blur of hard work and adjustment. Grace rose before dawn each morning to start the fire in the stove and prepare breakfast bacon and eggs and biscuits that she learned to make from the supplies in the pantry and the faded cookbook Mrs. Patterson had left behind. Jack ate with quiet efficiency, thanked her politely, and then disappeared into the day's work, leaving her to figure out the rhythms of the household on her own. She swept and scrubbed, washed clothes in a large tub behind the house and hung them to dry in the relentless sun, gathered eggs from the chickens and learned which hens were temperamental and which were docile. She attempted to revive the struggling vegetable garden, watering it in the early morning and late evening when the heat was less intense, pulling weeds that seemed to sprout overnight. Her hands, which had been soft despite her years of sewing, developed calluses and blisters that eventually hardened into toughness. Jack was unfailingly polite, always courteous, but he kept a careful distance between them. He did not linger over meals, did not sit with her in the evenings, did not engage in the kind of casual conversation that might have made them something more than employer and employee. Grace told herself she was grateful for his restraint, that it was proper and appropriate given their situation, but she could not deny the small ache of loneliness that settled in her chest as the days passed. On Sunday of her first week, Jack surprised her by announcing at breakfast that they would be going into town for church services. "You do not have to come if you do not want to," he said, "but I thought you might like to meet some of the townspeople, and church is the best place for that. They will be curious about you anyway. Might as well get it over with. Grace agreed, though the prospect made her nervous. She dressed in her best dress, which was also her only dress, the one she had worn on the train, and tried to tame her hair into something presentable. When she emerged from her room, she found Jack waiting on the porch, wearing clean trousers and a white shirt that made his tanned skin look even darker. He had shaved and combed his hair, and Grace caught herself staring before she quickly looked away. The ride into town was easier this time. Grace was growing more comfortable on horseback, more accustomed to the feel of copper beneath her and Jack's solid presence behind her. They talked of small things, the weather, the cattle, the state of the garden, safe topics that kept the conversation flowing without venturing into dangerous territory. The church in Quartz Hill was a simple white building with a steeple and a bell, situated on a slight rise at the edge of town. Wagons and horses filled the yard around it, and people in their Sunday best stood in clusters talking and laughing. Grace felt their attention shift to her the moment Jack helped her down from copper, felt the weight of their curiosity and speculation. A woman detached herself from one of the groups and came toward them, smiling warmly. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple but well-made dress. "Jack Erikson, you have been holding out on us. Are you going to introduce us to your guest?" Jack's hand touched Grace's elbow briefly, a gesture of support. "This is Grace Remington. She is my new housekeeper. Grace, this is Martha Henderson. She and her husband run the general store in town." Martha's eyes sparkled with interest, but her smile remained warm. "Welcome to Quartz Hill, Miss Remington. We heard about what happened with that terrible man and his false advertisements. I am so sorry you were taken in by that scheme." "Thank you," Grace said, lifting her chin slightly. "Jack was kind enough to offer me employment. I am very grateful." "Jack is one of the good ones," Martha said, patting his arm affectionately. "You could not ask for a better employer. Now come, let me introduce you to some of the other ladies. We have a quilting circle that meets every other Wednesday, and we are always looking for new members." Before Grace could respond, Martha had linked her arm through Grace's and was leading her toward a group of women who were watching with undisguised interest. Grace glanced back at Jack, who gave her an encouraging nod before he was claimed by a group of men who wanted to talk about cattle prices and water rights. The next hour was a whirlwind of names and faces. Grace met Sarah Thompson, the school teacher who had unknowingly been part of the reason Grace had been lured to Quartz Hill. The false telegram had claimed Sarah was leaving and needed a replacement. Sarah was mortified when she learned this, insisting she had no plans to go anywhere and offering to help Grace however she could. Grace also met Ellen Morris, who ran the boarding house, Constance Perry, whose husband owned the mining office, and half a dozen other women whose names immediately blurred together in her mind. They were welcoming, if curious, asking carefully worded questions about her background, her plans, her relationship with Jack. Grace answered as honestly as she could without revealing too much, maintaining the careful distance of propriety while trying to be friendly enough that they would not see her as standoffish. The church service was traditional, led by a young minister named Reverend Sawyer who preached about faith and perseverance with genuine passion. Grace found herself listening intently, finding comfort in the familiar words and hymns, in the sense of community that filled the small building. She had not realized how much she missed this, the simple act of gathering with others to worship, to sing, to share in something larger than herself. After the service, Martha insisted that Grace and Jack join her family for Sunday dinner. "No arguments," she said firmly when Jack tried to politely decline. "Robert is roasting a chicken and we have more than enough. Besides, Miss Remington needs to feel welcome in this town, and the best way to do that is to break bread together. So they found themselves seated around the Hendersons' table, along with Martha's husband Robert, a barrel-chested man with a booming laugh, and their two grown sons, both of whom were clearly interested in Grace, until a sharp look from their mother made them remember their manners. The food was excellent, the conversation lively, and Grace felt some of the tension she had been carrying begin to ease. "How are you finding ranch life?" Robert asked her as they were finishing their meal. "It is a far cry from Boston, I imagine." "It is different," Grace admitted. "But not in a bad way. It is challenging, but there is something satisfying about the work, about seeing tangible results at the end of the day." "She has done wonders with the house," Jack said, surprising her. It was the first time he had offered praise, and Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. "Everything is cleaner and more organized than it has been in months, and her cooking is a vast improvement over my own." "High praise indeed," Martha said, her eyes twinkling. Jack is not one to give compliments lightly. The conversation moved on to other topics: town gossip, news from Sacramento, speculation about the upcoming winter, and Grace found herself relaxing into the easy rhythm of it, feeling more at home than she had since leaving Boston. These people were different from the reserved New Englanders she had grown up with, more open and direct, but there was a genuine kindness beneath their curiosity that made her feel accepted. As the afternoon wore on and they prepared to leave, Martha pulled Grace aside. "I am glad you are here," she said quietly. "Jack has been alone too long. That business with Catherine nearly broke him, though he would never admit it. He needs someone like you, someone with strength and grace who can appreciate what he has built." Grace felt her cheeks flush. "I am just his housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson." Martha smiled knowingly. "Of course you are, dear. For now." And before Grace could protest, she was bustling them out the door with a basket of leftover chicken and fresh bread, making them promise to come back soon. The ride home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the sun sank toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Grace found herself acutely aware of Jack behind her, of the comfortable silence between them, of the way this was starting to feel normal, this closeness, this partnership, even if it was only professional. "Thank you for taking me today," Grace said as they approached the ranch. "Everyone was very kind. They are good people. I am glad you got to meet them." Jack paused, then added, "And I meant what I said at dinner. You have done excellent work this week. The house feels like a home again." Grace turned her head slightly, trying to see his face. "It is a good home. You should be proud of what you have built here." "I am," he said quietly, "but it is better with you in it." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that neither of them was ready to examine too closely. Grace's heart was beating faster, and she was suddenly very conscious of his arms around her, of the warmth of his body, of the way his breath stirred her hair. When they reached the house, Jack helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist just a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met in the fading light, and Grace saw something in his expression that made her breath catch a hunger, a loneliness, a question he was not quite ready to ask. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat. "I should tend to copper. Thank you for coming with me today." "Thank you for inviting me," Grace replied. And then she was walking toward the house, her legs unsteady, her mind racing with thoughts she should not be having about her employer, about this man who had saved her, about the possibility of something more than just the arrangement they had made. Inside her small room, she sat on the bed and pressed her hands to her burning cheeks, trying to calm her racing heart. This was foolish, dangerous even. She was dependent on Jack for everything: her job, her home, her very survival. To entertain romantic thoughts about him, was to risk losing it all, to put herself in a vulnerable position she could not afford. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, Grace could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, the way his hands had felt on her waist, the way his voice had softened when he said the house was better with her in it. And despite all her logical arguments against it, despite all the reasons it was a terrible idea, she felt that tiny seed of hope begin to grow. The weeks turned into a month, then two, and the rhythm of ranch life became second nature to Grace. She learned to anticipate Jack's needs, to have coffee ready when he came in from early morning chores, to pack hearty lunches when he had to ride out to check on distant pastures. She learned which of his shirts needed mending, how he liked his eggs cooked, that he had a weakness for apple pie when she could get the supplies to make it. And slowly, carefully, Jack began to let her in. He started staying for second cups of coffee after breakfast, talking about his plans for the ranch, asking her opinion on things that ranged from the color he should paint the barn to whether he should try raising sheep as well as cattle. He brought her books from town, having noticed how she read and reread the few volumes he had on his shelves. He taught her to ride properly, spending patient hours in the corral with her until she could mount and dismount on her own, until she could guide Copper with confidence. On a crisp October evening, after a supper of stew and fresh bread, Jack did not immediately retreat to his room as usual. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured toward the porch. "Walk with me. The stars should be coming out soon." Grace's heart skipped, but she nodded and followed him outside. The air had finally cooled with the approach of autumn, no longer the oppressive heat of summer. They stood side by side at the porch railing, sipping their coffee and watching the sky deepen from blue to purple to black, stars emerging one by one like diamonds scattered across velvet. "I have been thinking," Jack said after a long silence, "about what Martha said at church a few weeks back. About how this place feels more like a home with you here. She was right, but it is more than that." He turned to face her, and in the dim light from the house, Grace could see the intensity in his eyes. "You make everything better, Grace. Not just the house, not just the cooking and cleaning, but everything. Coming home feels different now. It feels like there is a reason to come home, something more than just work and sleep and work again." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She set down her coffee cup carefully, afraid her shaking hands would drop it. "Jack, I do not know what to say. You do not have to say anything. I just needed you to know." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration or nervousness she had come to recognize. "I know this is not what you signed up for. I know you came here expecting to be a teacher, not a housekeeper on an isolated ranch. But I cannot help hoping that maybe, just maybe, you do not hate it here, that maybe you feel even a fraction of what I am starting to feel." Grace's mind was reeling. She had tried so hard to keep her growing feelings locked away, to maintain professional distance, to protect herself from the vulnerability of caring too much. But hearing him speak with such raw honesty, seeing the hope and fear mingled in his expression, she found she could not maintain those careful walls any longer. "I do not hate it here," she said quietly. "I thought I would. I thought I would resent being trapped, being dependent, being so far from everything I knew. But instead, I find myself happier than I have been in years. I wake up eager to start the day. I go to bed feeling satisfied with what I have accomplished. And yes, Jack, a large part of that is because of you." She saw his shoulders relax, saw relief flood his features. "Grace, but I am afraid," she continued, needing to say it all before she lost her courage. "I am afraid of what it means to feel this way about you. I am afraid of losing the security I have found here if things go wrong. I am afraid of making a mistake that I cannot undo." Jack reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. "I am afraid too. I have been alone for so long, I have forgotten what it feels like to want someone in my life. And after Catherine, I swore I would not put my heart at risk again. But you are not Catherine. You are strong and brave and adaptable. You see this place, this life, and instead of turning away from it, you embrace it. You make me want to be better, to build something even greater than I imagined. And I cannot keep pretending that you are just my housekeeper, when every time I look at you, I see my future." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such sincere emotion, such vulnerability. "What are you asking, Jack?" "I am asking if you will give this a chance. Give us a chance. Not as employer and employee, but as two people who might be able to build something real together. I am not asking for forever, not yet. Just asking if you will let me court you properly. Let me show you how much you mean to me. Let us see where this might lead." Grace thought of all the reasons she should say no, all the practical arguments against risking the stability she had found. But when she looked into Jack's eyes and saw the hope there, when she felt his hand holding hers with such gentle strength, all those arguments crumbled away. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will give us a chance." The smile that broke across Jack's face was worth every risk, every fear. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her, and Grace rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other under the vast canopy of stars, neither speaking because words were not necessary. When they finally pulled apart, Jack cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with such tenderness that Grace felt her breath catch. "I am going to do this right," he said. "I am going to court you the way you deserve, and when I finally ask you to marry me, it will be because you know exactly what you are getting and you want it anyway." "When, not if?" Grace asked, a smile tugging at her lips. "When," Jack confirmed, his voice full of quiet certainty. "Because I already know, Grace. I knew the moment I saw you standing on that platform, lost and frightened but refusing to break. I knew when you accepted my offer without hesitation, when you threw yourself into this life without complaint. I knew when I came home one evening and heard you singing while you cooked and realized that sound was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I knew. I am just giving you time to catch up." Grace laughed, a sound of pure joy that surprised her. "You are very confident, Mr. Erikson." "Only about the things that matter most," he said, and then he kissed her forehead gently, a promise of more to come. "Now, let me walk you to your door like a proper gentleman before I forget myself entirely." They went inside, still holding hands, neither wanting to break the connection. At the door to her room, Jack kissed her hand, his eyes holding hers. "Good night, Grace. Sleep well." "Good night, Jack." Grace closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing, her whole body singing with happiness. She had stepped off that train 2 months ago with nothing, expecting disaster, finding instead the kind of love she had only read about in novels. It seemed impossible, too good to be true, but the warmth of Jack's hand still lingered on hers, and she could not deny the reality of what was happening between them. She was falling in love. No, she realized with sudden clarity she had already fallen. Now she just had to trust that Jack would catch her, that this beautiful, impossible thing they were building together would last. The courtship began in earnest the next morning. Jack brought her wildflowers he had picked on his early morning ride, presenting them with a bashful smile that made Grace's heart melt. She arranged them in a jar on the kitchen table, and every time she looked at them throughout the day, she found herself smiling. That Sunday, they went to church together, and this time when Jack helped her down from Copper, he did not immediately step away. He offered her his arm, and they walked into church together like a real couple, facing the interested stares and knowing smiles of the congregation with their heads held high. After the service, Martha pulled Grace aside with barely contained excitement. "I knew it. I told Robert just last week that you two were perfect for each other. How did it happen? When did he finally work up the courage to say something?" Grace found herself blushing but smiling. "Just a few days ago. We are taking things slowly." "Slowly is good," Martha said sagely. "But not too slowly. Life is short, my dear, and when you find someone who makes you happy, you should hold onto them with both hands." Over the following weeks, Jack courted Grace with a patience and attention that took her breath away. He carved her a jewelry box from pine, spending his evenings painstakingly sanding and polishing it until it was smooth as silk. He taught her to shoot, setting up targets behind the barn and standing behind her to correct her stance, his arms around her as he helped her aim. He took her on long rides through the countryside, showing her hidden valleys and streams, sharing his dreams for the future of the ranch. And he talked to her, really talked, sharing stories of his childhood as the son of a restless wanderer, his decision to break that pattern and build something permanent. He told her about the 5 years he spent working for Thomas Whitmore, learning everything he could about ranching and land management. He confessed his fears that he was not smart enough, not educated enough, not refined enough for a woman like her. "That is ridiculous," Grace said fiercely when he voiced this last concern. They were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun set over the mountains. "You are one of the most intelligent people I have ever met. You built this ranch from nothing. You understand animals and land and business. You are kind and honest and hardworking. Education is not just what you learn from books, Jack. It is what you learn from living, and you have learned more than most men twice your age." Jack pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "How did I get so lucky? To have you walk into my life when I had almost given up hope. I am the lucky one," Grace murmured against his chest. "You saved me, Jack, in every way a person can be saved." "No," he said firmly, tilting her chin up so she had to look at him. "You saved yourself. You made the choice to accept help, to work hard, to build a new life. I just provided the opportunity. Everything else was you." Grace felt tears sting her eyes, moved by his words, by his belief in her. "I love you," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I know it is too soon. I know I should wait, but I cannot hold it in anymore. I love you, Jack Erikson." The joy that lit his face was incandescent. "It is not too soon," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I love you too, Grace Remington. I have loved you since the day you stepped off that train and looked at me like I might be your last hope. I have loved you through every meal you have cooked, every smile you have given me, every moment we have spent building this life together. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." He kissed her then, really kissed her, his lips warm and gentle on hers. Grace melted into him, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, her heart soaring with a happiness so intense it was almost painful. They kissed until they were both breathless, until the sun had fully set and the stars were emerging overhead, until finally Jack pulled back with obvious reluctance. "I should stop," he said, his voice husky. "I should be a gentleman and let you go to bed." "What if I do not want you to be a gentleman?" Grace asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Jack groaned, resting his forehead against hers. "Do not tempt me, Grace. I want to do this right. I want to marry you first, make you my wife properly. I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours, legally and morally and in every way that matters. Can you wait? Can you give me a few more weeks to arrange things?" Grace pulled back slightly, searching his face. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am asking you to let me ask you properly." There are things I need to do first. Please, just trust me." Grace nodded, even though part of her wanted to protest that she did not need anything fancy, that she would marry him tomorrow if he asked. But she could see how important this was to him, how much he wanted to do things the right way, and she loved him for it. "I trust you," she said. "I will wait." The next few weeks were the longest and shortest of Grace's life. Jack made a mysterious trip into town and came back tight-lipped about where he had been. He spent his evenings in the barn, working on something he would not let her see. He was attentive and loving but also distracted, clearly planning something. Grace tried to be patient, throwing herself into preparations for winter, preserving vegetables from the garden, making sure the house was stocked with supplies for the cold months ahead. She also made herself a new dress, using fabric that Martha had helped her select during one of their trips to town. It was a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, more fashionable than anything she had owned in years, and she hoped Jack would like it. On Thanksgiving Day, Jack surprised her by announcing that they were having guests for dinner. Thomas and Lydia Whitmore, his former employers, were coming, along with Reverend Sawyer and Martha and Robert Henderson. Grace spent the morning in a frenzy of cooking, preparing a turkey Jack had acquired from somewhere and all the traditional side dishes. She was nervous about meeting the Whitmores, about impressing these people who clearly meant so much to Jack. The guests arrived in the early afternoon, and Grace's nervousness melted away almost immediately. Thomas Whitmore was a bear of a man with silver hair and a booming laugh, and his wife Lydia was elegant and warm, embracing Grace as though they were already family. Reverend Sawyer was his usual earnest self, and the Hendersons were as friendly and welcoming as always. They ate the elaborate meal Grace had prepared, everyone praising her cooking extravagantly. The conversation flowed easily, full of laughter and stories, and Grace found herself relaxing into it, feeling like she truly belonged. After the dishes were cleared, Jack stood up, his hand on Grace's shoulder. "I want to thank you all for coming today," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "You have been my friends, my mentors, my family when I had no family of my own, and now I want you here to witness something important." He turned to Grace, taking both her hands in his, and she realized with a jolt what was happening. Her heart began to race as he knelt on one knee in front of her, in front of all these people who had become her community. "Grace Remington," Jack said, his eyes locked on hers, "you walked into my life when I least expected it and turned everything upside down in the best possible way. You have made this house a home, made my days brighter, made me believe in possibilities I had stopped dreaming about. You are strong and beautiful and kind, and I cannot imagine spending another day without you by my side. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my love for the rest of our lives?" He pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light. Grace recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Lydia Whitmore, who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Jack must have gone to them, asked for their blessing, been given this family heirloom to present to her. "Yes," Grace said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Jack, I will marry you." The room erupted in cheers and applause as Jack slipped the ring onto her finger and then stood, pulling her into his arms and kissing her soundly. Grace laughed against his lips, joy bubbling up inside her like champagne, overwhelming and effervescent. When they finally pulled apart, she was surrounded by well-wishers, hugged by Lydia and Martha, congratulated by Thomas and Robert, blessed by Reverend Sawyer, who promised to perform the ceremony whenever they were ready. It was perfect, more than she could have dreamed, this public declaration of love surrounded by people who cared about them both. Later, after the guests had left and they were cleaning up together, Grace looked down at the ring on her finger, still hardly able to believe it was real. "When do you want to get married?" she asked. "As soon as possible," Jack said immediately. "Tomorrow, if you would agree to it. But I know women usually want time to plan, to prepare. So whenever you are ready, that is when we will do it." Grace thought about elaborate weddings, about the months of preparation that were traditional. Then she thought about what she actually wanted, which was simply to be Jack's wife, to make their commitment official, to start the next chapter of their life together. 2 weeks, she said decisively. 2 weeks is enough time to make sure everything is ready, to let people know, but not so long that I have to wait forever. Jack grinned, pulling her into his arms. 2 weeks it is, though I warn you it is going to be the longest 2 weeks of my life. Grace wrapped her arms around his neck, standing on her toes to kiss him. "Mine too, but it will be worth the wait." The 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Martha took charge of organizing the reception, insisting it would be held at the church fellowship hall and that the women of the quilting circle would provide the food. Sarah Thompson offered to play the piano for the ceremony. Ellen Morris from the boarding house produced a veil that had been her mother's and insisted Grace wear it. The whole town seemed to be involved in the preparations, everyone excited about the wedding. Grace finished her green dress and made a simple wedding gown from white cotton, trimming it with lace that Martha donated from the general store. It was not the elaborate gown she had once imagined as a girl, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and she knew Jack would love it. The night before the wedding, Grace lay in her small room for the last time, staring at the ceiling and thinking about how dramatically her life had changed in just 4 months. She had arrived in Quartz Hill with nothing, expecting disaster, and instead found everything she had ever wanted. She found a home, a community, a purpose, and most importantly, she found Jack. There was a soft knock on her door and Jack's voice came through. "Grace, can I talk to you for a minute?" She wrapped a shawl around her nightgown and opened the door. Jack stood there in his shirt sleeves, his hair mussed as though he had been running his hands through it. "I could not sleep," he admitted. "I kept thinking about tomorrow, about how lucky I am, about how I want to make sure you never regret this decision." Grace reached out and took his hand. "I will not regret it, I promise." "I want to give you everything," Jack said intensely. "I want to build this ranch into something prosperous, something we can be proud of. I want to give you children if that is what you want, a family of our own. I want to make you happy every single day for the rest of your life." "You already make me happy," Grace said softly. "Everything else is just extra. I am not marrying you for what you can give me, Jack. I am marrying you because I love you, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it, because when I think about the future, you are in every single picture." Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I love you so much. Tomorrow cannot come fast enough." "Tomorrow is almost here," Grace murmured against his chest. "Just a few more hours and then we have forever." The wedding day dawned clear and cool, perfect December weather. Grace dressed carefully with Martha and Lydia helping, pinning up her hair and securing the borrowed veil. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She was glowing, radiant with happiness, so different from the frightened girl who had stepped off the train 4 months ago. The church was packed. It seemed like everyone in Quartz Hill had come to witness the ceremony. Grace walked down the aisle alone, having no one to give her away, but she did not feel alone. She felt the support of all these people who had welcomed her into their community, and more importantly, she felt the pull of Jack waiting for her at the altar, looking impossibly handsome in a new suit. His eyes locked on her with such love that she felt her breath catch. Reverend Sawyer performed the ceremony with his usual earnest sincerity. Grace and Jack spoke their vows clearly. their voices ringing through the church, promising to love and honor and cherish each other for all the days of their lives. When Jack slipped the wedding band onto her finger, joining the engagement ring already there, Grace felt a sense of rightness settle over her, as though all the pieces of her life had finally clicked into place. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Sawyer said with a smile, and Jack did not need to be told twice. He pulled Grace into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, to the cheers and applause of the congregation, and Grace kissed him back with all the love and joy and hope in her heart. The reception was a joyous affair, with music and dancing and more food than Grace had ever seen in one place. She danced with Jack, with Thomas Whitmore, with Robert Henderson, and with several other men from town who wanted to congratulate the bride. But mostly she stayed close to Jack, his arm around her waist, unwilling to be separated from him even for a moment. As the afternoon wore into evening, Jack leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Erikson." Grace shivered at the sound of her new name, at the promise in his voice. "Yes," she said. "Let us go home." They said their goodbyes amid much laughter and well wishes, enduring the traditional teasing about wedding nights and honeymoons. Then they were riding copper together back to the ranch, the stars emerging overhead, the cool night air sharp and clean. When they reached the house, Jack dismounted and then lifted Grace down, holding her in his arms instead of setting her on her feet. "I am carrying you over the threshold," he announced. "I know we have lived here together for months, but this is different. This is you coming home as my wife." He carried her through the door and into the house, which looked different somehow, warmer and more welcoming. Grace realized he had lit candles throughout the main room, their soft glow creating a romantic atmosphere. He set her gently on her feet, his hands lingering on her waist. "Welcome home, Grace," he said softly. "Welcome to the life we are going to build together." Grace reached up to cup his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "I am already home. I have been home since the day you handed me those reins and made me feel like I belonged somewhere. Now I just get to make it official." Jack kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Grace melted into him, all the restraint of the past months falling away now that they were finally, legally, married. This was her husband, her partner, her love, and she gave herself to him completely, trusting him to treat her heart with the same care and tenderness he had shown since the moment they met. The first months of their marriage were the happiest Grace had ever known. She and Jack fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day and falling into each other's arms at night. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts. Jack's knowledge and hard work, paired with Grace's organizational skills and attention to detail. When winter came in earnest, bringing cold winds and occasional snow to the mountains, they spent long evenings by the fire, Jack reading aloud while Grace sewed or knitted. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's thoughts and dreams, building the foundation of a life together. In the spring, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Jack over breakfast one morning, her hands shaking slightly as she placed his coffee in front of him. "I have something to tell you. I am going to have a baby." Jack's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, and then overwhelming happiness. He stood up so fast his chair fell over, pulling Grace into his arms and spinning her around. "A baby, Grace, we are going to have a baby." "Careful," Grace laughed, breathless from the spinning. "You will make me dizzy." He set her down gently, immediately solicitous. "Are you all right? Should you be on your feet? Do you need to rest?" "I am fine," Grace assured him. "Pregnant women do not need to be wrapped in cotton. I can still work, still do everything I normally do, at least for a while." "I am going to take care of you," Jack said firmly. "You and our child. I am going to make sure you have everything you need." He was true to his word. As Grace's pregnancy progressed, Jack became increasingly protective, taking over the heavier household tasks, insisting she rest whenever possible. He brought her little gifts from town: a book, a jar of peaches, a ribbon for her hair just to see her smile. He talked to her belly at night, telling their unborn child about the ranch, about the horses and cattle, about all the things they would do together. In October, exactly 1 year after Jack had proposed, Grace went into labor. Martha Henderson and Lydia Whitmore came to help, shooing Jack out of the house despite his protests that he wanted to stay with his wife. The labor was long and difficult, testing Grace's strength to its limits, but when she finally held her son in her arms, red-faced and squalling, she felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. Jack was allowed back in to meet his son, and Grace would never forget the expression on his face as he looked down at the baby: wonder and love and fear all mixed together. "He is perfect," Jack breathed, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. "Grace, he is absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Grace asked, exhausted but happy. They had discussed names for months without coming to any decision. Now, looking at their son, Jack said, "James. After my grandfather, the only member of my father's family who ever tried to give me a stable home. James Thomas, if that is all right with you. Thomas for Mr. Whitmore, who made all of this possible." "James Thomas Erikson," Grace said, testing the name. "I love it." Little James thrived, growing from a tiny newborn into a robust baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Jack was a devoted father, spending every free moment with his son, carrying him around the ranch in a sling Grace made, introducing him to the horses and cattle as though the baby could understand. The ranch continued to prosper. Jack expanded his herd, bought more land, built a new barn. Grace managed the household and raised James while also keeping the books for the ranch, her neat handwriting recording every transaction, every profit and loss. They made a good team, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. When James was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier and the labor shorter. She delivered a daughter in the spring of 1885, a tiny thing with blonde hair and blue eyes that would eventually turn brown like her father's. They named her Margaret Rose, called her Maggie from the start. Jack loved his daughter with the same fierce devotion he showed James, but Grace saw the special tenderness he reserved for Maggie. The way he cradled her so carefully, the way his voice softened when he talked to her. "I never knew I could love someone so much it actually hurt," he told Grace one night as they watched their children sleeping, James in his small bed and Maggie in her cradle. "I know," Grace said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "It terrifies me sometimes, how much I love them." "How much I love you. It feels like my heart is walking around outside my body." Jack kissed her temple. "We will keep them safe. We will give them a good life, teach them to be strong and kind. And we will love each other and show them what a real marriage looks like, so they know what to look for when it is their turn." The years passed, marked by the changing of the seasons and the growth of their children. James learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk, following his father around the ranch with devoted determination. Maggie was quieter, more thoughtful, preferring to help her mother in the garden or with the cooking. Both children were loved and cherished, growing up secure in the knowledge that they were wanted. Grace never forgot where she had come from, never forgot the desperate woman who had stepped off that train with nothing. Every day she woke up grateful for the life she had built, for the man she had married, for the children they had created together. She sometimes thought about what would have happened if Jack had not been there that day, if he had not offered her a lifeline when she needed it most, and the thought always made her shiver. But he had been there. He had seen her in her moment of greatest need and had reached out, not with pity but with respect, offering her work and dignity instead of charity. And from that beginning, they had built something real and lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jack surprised Grace with a party. The whole town came to the ranch, which had grown considerably over the years. There was a new, larger house now, built to accommodate their growing family and the life they had created. The old house still stood, used for storage and overflow guests, a reminder of where they had started. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Jack pulled Grace aside, leading her away from the crowd to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, and Grace leaned against her husband's side, content and happy. "You remember the day you arrived?" Jack asked. "The day I handed you Copper's reins and said, 'Welcome home.'" "I remember," Grace said softly. "I thought you were crazy. I did not feel like I was home at all. I felt lost and frightened and completely out of my depth. But you stayed. You trusted me, even when you had no reason to. You gave us a chance." "Best decision I ever made," Grace said, turning to face him. "You gave me everything, Jack. A home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love when I thought I would never find it. You saved me." Jack shook his head, pulling her close. "We saved each other. I was lost too, Grace, even if I did not realize it. I was building this ranch, working myself to exhaustion, but I had no one to share it with. You gave my life meaning. You made everything worth it." Grace reached up to kiss him, a sweet, lingering kiss that held 10 years of love and partnership. "Here is to the next 10 years," she said when they pulled apart, "and the 10 after that and all the years we have together." "All the years," Jack agreed. "Forever, Grace. That is what I promised you, and that is what I intend to deliver." As they walked back to the party hand in hand, Grace looked around at the ranch, at the house that was truly a home, at the friends and neighbors who had become family, at her children playing with the other kids, and she felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost overwhelmed her. She had stepped off that train with nothing, expecting her life to be over, and instead found that it was just beginning. The years continued to unfold with a gentle rhythm that Grace came to cherish. James grew into a strong, capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, learning everything Jack could teach him about cattle and horses and the land. Maggie blossomed into a beautiful girl with her father's quiet strength and her mother's intelligence, helping Grace manage the household and showing an unexpected talent for raising chickens and selling eggs in town. When James turned 18 in 1891, Jack formally made him a partner in the ranch, acknowledging the hard work and dedication his son had shown. The pride on Jack's face during that announcement brought tears to Grace's eyes, remembering how her husband had once worried about having something to pass down to his children. Now he had built an empire well. Perhaps empire was too strong a word, but the Erikson Ranch was one of the most successful in the county, known for quality cattle and fair dealing. Maggie, at 16, had begun attracting suitors, much to Jack's consternation. Grace found it amusing watching her husband try to intimidate the young men who came calling, while Maggie rolled her eyes and assured her father that she was in no hurry to get married, that she wanted to see something of the world first. "She reminds me of you," Jack told Grace one evening after he had scared off yet another hopeful suitor. "Independent, strong-willed, not willing to settle for less than she deserves." "And that is a bad thing?" Grace asked, amused. "No," Jack admitted. "I just wish she was still 5 years old and thought I could solve any problem in the world." "She still thinks that," Grace assured him. She just does not admit it as readily. In 1893, when Grace was 42 and Jack was 45, they were surprised to discover that Grace was pregnant again. Both children were nearly grown, and they had assumed their family was complete. But this unexpected blessing was welcomed with joy, even if it meant starting over with midnight feedings and dirty diapers. Their third child, a son they named Daniel Jack, was born in the spring of 1894. James and Maggie doted on their baby brother, and Grace found herself enjoying motherhood in a different way this time around, more relaxed and confident than she had been with her first two children. Jack, too, approached fatherhood differently at 46 than he had at 26. He was more patient, less anxious, taking time to simply enjoy his son rather than constantly worrying about doing everything perfectly. He would sit on the porch for hours with Daniel on his lap, pointing out birds and clouds and telling stories about the ranch and the land. James married in 1896, taking as his bride a sweet-natured girl named Elizabeth from a neighboring ranch. They built a small house on the Erikson property, planning to raise their own family while helping run the ranch. Jack was thrilled to have his son staying close, to know that the legacy he had built would continue through the generations. Maggie, meanwhile, surprised everyone by announcing at 20 that she wanted to go to San Francisco to attend the normal school there, to become a teacher. Grace saw echoes of her own younger self in her daughter's determination, her hunger for education and purpose beyond what was expected of women. "Let her go," Grace told Jack when he expressed reservations about his daughter living alone in the big city. "She is smart and capable, and she deserves the chance to follow her dreams. We will make sure she has somewhere safe to live, people to check on her. But we cannot keep her here if her heart is calling her elsewhere." So Maggie went to San Francisco, writing long letters home about her studies and the fascinating people she met and the world that was so much bigger and more diverse than Quartz Hill. Grace treasured those letters, proud of her daughter's accomplishments while missing her terribly. The new century arrived, bringing with it changes and challenges. The ranch had to adapt to new technologies, new markets, new ways of doing things. Jack, with James's help and input, navigated these changes with the same careful planning and hard work that had built the ranch in the first place. Daniel grew up surrounded by love and attention, perhaps a bit spoiled by his older siblings but fundamentally good-natured and kind. He showed early signs of being interested in horses, spending hours in the stables learning to care for them and ride them. In 1902, Maggie returned home from San Francisco with a teaching certificate and a fiancé, a young lawyer named Peter Collins, who looked at her with such obvious adoration that even Jack could not find fault with him. They married that summer, and Maggie took the teaching position in Quartz Hill that had supposedly been available 18 years earlier when Grace had first arrived. Grace attended the first day of Maggie's teaching career, sitting in the back of the schoolroom and watching her daughter with tears in her eyes. This was what she had wanted all those years ago, what she had traveled across the country hoping to achieve. She had not become a teacher herself, but she had raised one, and that felt like its own kind of victory. James and Elizabeth had 3 children in quick succession, giving Grace and Jack grandchildren to spoil and love. The ranch was full of life and laughter, multiple generations living and working together, exactly the kind of family Jack had dreamed of when he first bought the land. As Grace moved into her 50s, she sometimes marveled at the passage of time, at how the desperate young woman who had stepped off that train had become this matriarch of a thriving family. Her hair had streaks of gray now, and her hands showed the wear of years of hard work, but she had never been happier. Jack aged too, his dark hair now mostly silver, his face deeply lined from years in the sun. But he was still strong, still capable, still the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Their love had deepened and matured with time, becoming something solid and unshakable, tested by life's challenges and emerging stronger each time. They still took evening walks together when weather permitted, still sat on the porch and watched the stars, still talked about everything and nothing. After more than 25 years of marriage, they could communicate with just a look, could finish each other's sentences, could sense when the other needed comfort or space, or simply a hand to hold. In 1908, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a huge party that brought people from all over the county. Grace wore a new dress made of blue silk, and Jack wore his best suit, and they renewed their vows in front of their children and grandchildren, their friends and neighbors, everyone who had been part of their journey. 25 years ago, I married the woman of my dreams, Jack said during his toast at the reception. I married someone who was brave enough to take a chance on a stranger, who worked harder than anyone I have ever known, who built this life alongside me through good times and bad. Grace, you are my partner, my love, my home. Everything good in my life comes from you. Here is to 25 more years and then another 25 after that, for as long as we both shall live. Grace raised her glass, her eyes misty with happy tears. Here is to the man who saved me when I had nothing, who gave me everything, who showed me what love really means. You are my heart, Jack Erikson. Always have been, always will be. The party went long into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling. Grace danced with Jack, with James, with Peter, with Thomas Whitmore, who was now in his 80s but still spry. She held her grandchildren and listened to old friends reminisce about the early days, about how far they had all come. When they finally made it home to their house, to their bed, to the life they had built together, Jack pulled Grace close and simply held her, his chin resting on top of her head. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for saying yes, for trusting me, for building this life with me." "Thank you for being there that day," Grace replied, "for seeing me when I felt invisible, for offering me hope when I had none left." They stood there in the darkness, holding each other, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting. The ranch was quiet around them, their family sleeping under the same sky, safe and loved and secure in the knowledge that they belonged. Grace thought back to that day on the train platform, to the desperate woman she had been, to the man on horseback who had changed her entire life with a simple act of kindness. She thought about the moment he had handed her copper's reins and said, "Welcome home," even though she had not felt welcome, had not felt at home at all. But he had seen something she could not see yet, the possibility, the potential, the future they could build together. He had welcomed her home before it was her home, before she knew it could be her home, and in doing so, he had made it real. Now, more than a quarter century later, Grace could say with absolute certainty that she was home. Not just because of the physical place, though she loved this ranch with every fiber of her being, but because of the man beside her, the family they had created, the love that surrounded them like a warm blanket. She had stepped off that train with nothing, expecting disaster. Instead, she had found everything, and she would be grateful for that every single day for the rest of her life. The years marched on with their steady rhythm. Daniel grew into a fine young man who decided to focus on breeding horses rather than cattle, developing a program that brought recognition to the Erikson Ranch from buyers throughout California. At 21, he married a spirited young woman named Catherine, not the Catherine who had broken Jack's heart so many years ago, but a completely different person with the same name, and they built their own house on the far side of the ranch property, wanting to be close to family while also having their independence. Maggie and Peter had 2 children, and she managed to balance teaching with motherhood in a way that made Grace proud. James and Elizabeth's family continued to grow, eventually totaling 5 children who ran wild around the ranch, learning to ride and rope and take care of animals almost before they could walk. In 1912, Thomas Whitmore passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 86. Jack grieved deeply for the man who had given him his start, who had believed in him when few others did. At the funeral, Jack spoke movingly about Thomas's generosity and wisdom, about how he had changed the lives of everyone he touched. Lydia Whitmore squeezed Jack's hand afterward, tears streaming down her face, thanking him for honoring her husband's memory so beautifully. The First World War touched even their remote corner of California, with young men from Quartz Hill enlisting to fight overseas. James was too old to serve, but he helped organize support efforts at home, raising money and supplies for the troops. Grace joined the Women's Auxiliary, knitting socks and rolling bandages, worrying about the sons of friends and neighbors who had gone off to fight. Through it all, the ranch endured. There were good years and bad years, times of plenty and times of struggle. They weathered droughts that left the pastures brown and brittle, winters that were harsher than usual, market fluctuations that affected cattle prices. But they had built their foundation strong, and they weathered every storm together. Jack began to slow down as he moved into his 60s. The hard physical labor of ranching took its toll, and he finally had to admit that he could not do everything himself anymore. James took over more and more of the day-to-day operations, making decisions in consultation with his father but fundamentally running things. Jack found it difficult at first, this transition from leader to advisor, but Grace helped him see that this was the natural order of things, that he had raised his son well, and could trust him to carry on the legacy. "You built something that will last," Grace told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over mountains that had become as familiar as old friends. "You created not just a ranch but a family business, something that your children and grandchildren will carry forward. That is an incredible accomplishment." Jack reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "We built it, not just me. Everything I have, everything I am, is because of you." Grace smiled, squeezing his hand. They were both in their 60s now, their hair silver, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. But when she looked at Jack, she still saw the man who had handed her those reins on her first day in Quartz Hill, still felt the same flutter in her chest that she had felt that day. In 1920, as they approached their 35th wedding anniversary, Grace and Jack decided to take a trip. They had never traveled much beyond California, too busy with the ranch and raising children. But now, with James and Elizabeth firmly in charge and their younger children grown and settled, they gave themselves permission to do something just for them. They took the train to San Francisco, staying in a hotel that overlooked the bay. They walked through the city where Maggie had attended school, ate in restaurants where other people cooked for them, attended a theatrical performance that left Grace breathless with delight. For a week, they were simply Jack and Grace, not ranchers or parents or grandparents, just 2 people in love enjoying each other's company. On their last evening in San Francisco, they walked along the waterfront, watching ships come and go from the harbor. Jack put his arm around Grace's shoulders, pulling her close against the evening chill. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going back east, living this life instead of the one you thought you would have?" Grace looked up at him, surprised by the question. "Regret?" Jack, I have never regretted a single moment. Well, perhaps a few moments, she amended with a smile. But overall, this life, this family, you are everything I never knew I wanted. How could I possibly regret that? I just want to make sure, Jack said. I want to make sure you have been happy. Grace turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. I have been happier than I ever imagined possible. You made me happy, Jack Erikson. You made me whole. And I love you more now than I did the day I married you, which I would not have thought possible. Jack kissed her there on the waterfront, with ships' horns sounding in the background and the smell of salt air all around them. And Grace felt the same thrill she had felt on their wedding day, the same sense of rightness and belonging. When they returned to the ranch, they found everything running smoothly in their absence. James had managed beautifully, as they knew he would. Daniel had made progress with his horse breeding program. The grandchildren had grown perceptibly in just the week they had been gone. Life settled back into its familiar rhythms. Grace continued to manage the household, though she had help now from Elizabeth and from Catherine, Daniel's wife. The three women worked well together, sharing responsibilities and supporting each other. Grace taught her daughters-in-law everything she had learned about running a ranch household, about preserving food and managing budgets, and keeping everything organized. She also spent time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about the old days, about their grandfather's courage and kindness, about how the ranch had grown from almost nothing into what it was today. She wanted them to understand their heritage, to appreciate the sacrifice and hard work that had built what they enjoyed. In 1923, Lydia Whitmore passed away at 89, leaving Grace as one of the few remaining connections to the earliest days of the ranch. At Lydia's funeral, Grace spoke about how the older woman had welcomed her, helped her, treated her like a daughter when she had no family of her own. She removed the engagement ring from her finger, the one that had been Lydia's mother's, and gave it to Maggie, wanting to pass on the legacy to the next generation. The 1920s brought prosperity to the ranch and to the country as a whole. The cattle market was strong. Daniel's horses were in high demand, and they were able to make improvements to the property that would have been impossible in earlier years. They added electricity, installed indoor plumbing, bought a truck to supplement the horses and wagons they had always relied on. But Grace and Jack did not let the prosperity change them fundamentally. They remembered too well what it was like to struggle, to worry about having enough, to work from dawn to dusk just to survive. They were generous with their good fortune, helping neighbors who were struggling, contributing to the church and the school, making sure that others had the same opportunities they had been given. In 1925, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary quietly, just family this time. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a Sunday dinner that stretched from noon until evening, full of laughter and love. Grace looked around the table at all these people who existed because she and Jack had found each other, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. James stood to make a toast, raising his glass. To my parents, who showed me what a real marriage looks like. You taught me that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day, a commitment you honor through good times and bad. You built this ranch and this family with your own hands, and everything we have is because of you. Thank you for being the best example anyone could ask for. Grace wiped tears from her eyes as everyone raised their glasses. Jack squeezed her hand under the table, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Later, when everyone had gone home and they were alone in their bedroom, Jack pulled Grace into his arms. 40 years, he said wonderingly. How did that happen so fast? I do not know, Grace admitted. It feels like just yesterday I stepped off that train. And it also feels like I have loved you forever. Forever is what we promised each other, Jack reminded her, and we have kept that promise. We have, Grace agreed, and I would make the same promise again in a heartbeat. They were in their 70s now, their bodies showing the inevitable effects of age. Jack's hands were stiff with arthritis some mornings, and Grace tired more easily than she used to. But they were still together, still in love, still committed to the life they had built. In 1928, Quartz Hill celebrated its 50th anniversary as an incorporated town. There was a huge celebration, with historical displays and speeches and a parade down Main Street. Jack and Grace were honored as among the oldest residents, asked to speak about the early days, about how different everything had been back then. Grace stood before the assembled townspeople and told them about arriving with nothing, about being stranded and afraid, about the cowboy who had offered her a job and a future. She looked at Jack as she spoke, seeing him not as the silver-haired man he was now, but as the young man who had sat tall in his saddle and changed her entire life. "This town, this community, gave me everything," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "It gave me a home, a family, a purpose. But most of all, it gave me Jack, and that has made all the difference." The applause was thunderous. People came up afterward to shake their hands, to share their own stories of arrival and struggle and ultimate success. Grace felt part of something larger than herself, part of a community that had grown and thrived together over the decades. As the 1920s drew to a close and the 1930s began, the country was plunged into economic depression. The ranch, like everyone else, felt the impact. Cattle prices plummeted, making it hard to turn a profit. They had to make difficult decisions about what expenses to cut, how to keep the ranch viable during hard times, but they had weathered hard times before. They tightened their belts, helped each other, and endured. James proved himself to be as capable and resilient as his father had been, making smart decisions that kept the ranch afloat when others were going under. Grace found herself grateful for the skills she had learned in those early days, when they had to make do with very little. She knew how to stretch a dollar, how to make meals from almost nothing, how to mend and repair rather than replace. She taught these skills to her daughters-in-law and granddaughters, making sure the knowledge was passed down. Through it all, she and Jack remained each other's constant support. They had seen so much together, endured so much, celebrated so much. Their love had weathered every storm, emerging stronger and deeper with each passing year. On a quiet evening in 1935, as they sat on their porch watching another spectacular sunset, Grace leaned against Jack's shoulder and said, "I had a good life." Jack looked down at her, alarmed by the past tense. "Had? What do you mean, had? You are still having a good life." Grace smiled. "I am. But I just wanted to say it, in case I do not get another chance. I wanted to make sure you knew that every day with you has been a gift, that I would not change a single thing, even the hard parts, because they led me here to you, to this." Jack pulled her closer, his arms strong around her despite his age. "I love you, Grace Erikson. I loved you from the moment I saw you on that platform, and I will love you until my last breath, and probably beyond that, if there is any justice in the universe." "I love you too," Grace whispered. "More than words can say." They sat there as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars emerged, holding each other, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that mattered. They had raised children and grandchildren, built a successful ranch, contributed to their community, and most importantly, loved each other well. When Grace passed away in 1936 at the age of 74, peacefully in her sleep with Jack holding her hand, the entire town turned out for her funeral. People came from all over the county to pay their respects, to share stories about how Grace had touched their lives, helped them, inspired them. Maggie spoke about her mother's determination and strength, about how she had never given up despite facing impossible odds. James talked about her wisdom and patience, about how she had taught him to see beyond immediate obstacles to long-term solutions. Daniel shared memories of her laughter and love, about how she had always made time for her children no matter how busy she was. Jack could barely speak, his grief too overwhelming. But he managed to stand at the end and say simply, "She was the best person I ever knew. She made me better than I was. She gave my life meaning, and I will miss her every day until I see her again." He survived her by only 3 years, the light seeming to go out of him when Grace died. He continued to live on the ranch, surrounded by family, but everyone could see that he was just marking time, waiting to be reunited with his beloved wife. When Jack passed away in 1939 at 79, he was buried next to Grace in the Quartz Hill Cemetery, under a simple headstone that read, "Together Forever." At his funeral, James told the story one more time, the story of how his parents had met, how his father had handed his mother the reins and said, "Welcome home," how that single act of kindness had blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime. The ranch continued through the generations, just as Jack had hoped. James ran it capably until his own death, then passed it on to his eldest son. Daniel's horse breeding program became known throughout the West. Maggie's children and grandchildren became teachers and lawyers and ranchers, carrying forward the legacy of hard work and integrity their grandparents had established. And years later, when great-grandchildren who had never met Jack and Grace walked the land they had built together, they still told the story. The story of the woman who stepped off the train with nothing, lost and afraid, and the cowboy who gave her everything she needed to build a life. The story of a love that transformed 2 lives and echoed through generations, because that is what real love does. It does not just change the people who experience it. It ripples outward, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen, creating legacies that last long after the lovers themselves are gone. Grace Remington had stepped off that train expecting disaster. Instead, she found home, family, purpose, and love beyond measure. And in doing so, she and Jack created something that would endure, not just a ranch, not just a family, but a testament to the power of kindness, the resilience of the human spirit, and the transformative nature of love freely given and gratefully received. Their story became legend in Quartz Hill, passed down from parents to children, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the very best, that sometimes a single act of compassion can change everything, that love really can conquer all if we are brave enough to take the risk. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Jack and Grace were together again, riding through eternal golden valleys under endless blue skies, their love as strong and true as the day he first handed her those reins and welcomed her home.